The city does not know it is dying. Rome still wakes to the sound of footsteps on stone streets, to merchants lifting wooden shutters, to the distant murmur of fountains that have flowed for centuries. The sun rises over temples and forums that once ruled the world. Statues of emperors stare blindly ahead, chipped by time but still standing. To those who live here, Rome feels eternal, but eternity is already cracking. In the early hours before dawn, messengers ride through gates that are no longer guarded as they once were. Their horses are thin. Their faces carry the quiet panic of men who have seen too much. Beyond the walls, the world has changed. Provinces that once fed the city have fallen silent. Roads that once carried grain and gold now carry rumours. Of armies without banners, of kings without loyalty, of borders that exist only on maps. Rome, once the heart of the world, is becoming an island. For centuries, the empire was held together by something stronger than stone and steel. It was belief. The belief that Rome could not fall, that it was protected by its gods, its laws, its legions, and its destiny. But belief erodes slowly, and when it does, it leaves behind something far more dangerous: habit. People continue living as if tomorrow will be like yesterday, even when the foundations are already collapsing beneath their feet. By this hour, though no one marks it yet, the empire is already broken. The legions that once stood like iron walls along the frontiers are shadows of what they were. Some are underpaid, others are filled with men who were not born Roman, who do not speak Latin, who serve not out of loyalty, but necessity. The old system, citizen soldiers defending their homeland, is gone. In its place stands a fragile machine held together by gold, promises, and fear. And gold is running out. In the streets of Rome, inflation eats away at daily life. Coins are lighter than they used to be, shaved down, diluted. A loaf of bread costs more each month. Soldiers demand higher pay. Bureaucrats demand bribes. Officials sell offices to survive. Corruption is no longer a crime whispered about in back rooms. It is the system itself. Yet the Senate still meets. Old men in fading robes debate procedures and traditions, clinging to rituals that once governed an empire stretching from Britain to Egypt. They argue about titles, about honours, about who may speak first. Outside, the empire is bleeding. Inside, they rearrange shadows. The emperors come and go with frightening speed. Some rule for years, others for months, some for days. Many are raised by the army and destroyed by it. Authority no longer flows from Rome outward. It is dragged inward by force. Every general is a potential emperor. Every emperor lives knowing that his own guards may turn on him before nightfall. Power, once absolute, has become temporary. Far from the marble halls, on the edges of the empire, entire regions slip away, not with a battle, but with silence. Tax collectors stop arriving. Governors stop sending reports. Garrisons shrink, then vanish. Rome does not conquer its enemies anymore. It negotiates with them, hires them, settles them inside its own borders. The word barbarian still carries contempt, but it hides a terrifying truth. Rome needs them. Entire tribes are allowed to settle on Roman land in exchange for military service. They bring their families, their weapons, their customs. They fight for Rome, but not for its soul. The frontier is no longer a wall, it is a wound, constantly reopened. And still, the city sleeps. At this hour, temples stand quiet. Priests light incense to gods whose power feels distant. Christianity spreads through the empire, offering hope to the poor and discipline to the lost, but also dividing a population already fractured. Old gods fade, new beliefs rise, unity fractures not only politically, but spiritually. Rome no longer agrees on what it is. In the countryside, farmers abandon land that cannot be defended. Banditry becomes common. Travel grows dangerous. Roads once patrolled by soldiers now echo with silence. Trade slows. Cities shrink. People move closer to walls, to whatever protection remains. The empire is contracting. Inside Rome, rumours spread faster than facts. Some say the borders will hold. Others whisper that the gods have turned away. Most simply, try to survive the day. The idea that Rome could fall feels absurd, until it doesn't. This is not the moment of collapse. This is the moment before people realise collapse has already begun. Because while Rome debates, bargains and prays, something unstoppable is moving closer. Not as a single army, not as a sudden catastrophe, but as a slow convergence of failures, military, economic, political, and human. By the time the city hears the sound of approaching danger, it will already be too late. And the hours are running out. Morning comes quietly to Rome, as it has for centuries. Light spills over tiled roofs and marble facades, revealing a city that still believes in routine. Bakers prepare their ovens. Slavs sweep courtyards. Water flows through aqueducts that remain among the greatest achievements of the ancient world. To an outsider, Rome still looks powerful. To those inside it, life continues because it must. But power is no longer where it once was. At this hour, the empire is ruled not from Rome, but from elsewhere. The emperors have abandoned the city, choosing safer capitals closer to the frontiers: Milan, Ravenna, Constantinople. Rome, once the command centre of the world, has become a symbol without control. Decisions that shape its fate are made far away by men who rarely see its streets. The Senate still exists, but it no longer commands armies or provinces. It issues petitions, not orders. Its influence is ceremonial, its authority remembered rather than felt. Rome governs memory now, not reality. Outside the city, the borders of the Western Empire are unravelling. In Gaul, Roman authority weakens year by year. In Britain, legions have already withdrawn, leaving cities and villas behind to fend for themselves. In Hispania, loyalty is uncertain. Africa, once Rome's breadbasket, is slipping from imperial control. Each loss is not dramatic on its own, but together they starve the empire. Grain shipments arrive late. Sometimes they do not arrive at all. Food shortages do not announce themselves with panic at first. They creep in quietly. Portions shrink. Prices rise. The poor feel it immediately. The rich feel it eventually. The state responds with regulations and decrees, fixing prices by law. But laws cannot create food. They can only punish those who fail to provide it. Farmers abandon their land rather than meet impossible quotas. Tax collectors squeeze harder, accelerating the collapse they are meant to prevent. Villages empty. Cities contract inward. The countryside becomes dangerous. Rome's greatest strength was once its organisation. Now that same machinery grinds its people down. The army too is changing, and not for the better. At this hour, Roman soldiers wear Roman armour, but many no longer think of themselves as Roman. Recruitment draws heavily from non-Roman populations. Service is a contract, not a calling. Loyalty is personal, not institutional. A soldier follows his commander because that commander feeds him, protects him, and promises reward. When the commander falls, loyalty dies with him. The empire tries to solve its manpower crisis by integrating entire barbarian groups into the army. They fight as allies, then as mercenaries, then as something more dangerous, autonomous forces within Roman territory. They defend the empire, but they also learn its weaknesses, its politics, its divisions, its fear. Rome is teaching its future enemies how to defeat it. Inside the city, confidence fades slowly, replaced by superstition and anxiety. Omens are read into natural disasters. Floods, plagues, eclipses, all are signs that something is wrong. The old religious certainty has fractured. Christianity offers moral clarity, but also rejects many of Rome's ancient traditions. Pagan elites resist. Religious disputes turn violent. The empire no longer agrees on who it answers to: gods, laws, or emperors. By midday, news reaches Rome that another frontier has collapsed. Another agreement has failed. Another tribe has crossed a line that once meant something. The message is received, recorded, debated, and then buried under procedure. Rome has learned how to survive bad news without responding to it. This is how empires die, not with a single blow, but with 1,000 ignored warnings. In distant camps beyond the Alps, leaders watch Roman indecision with growing confidence. They see that Rome negotiates instead of punishes, that it pays instead of commands, that its threats no longer terrify. Rome is still powerful, but it no longer inspires fear. As afternoon approaches, the illusion of control remains intact within the city walls. Markets stay open, courts hear cases, life continues. But outside, the forces gathering against Rome are no longer scattered. They are aligning, learning, adapting. The empire is no longer facing chaos. It is facing replacement. And Rome, trapped in its habits and memories, does not yet understand that the danger is no longer theoretical. It is approaching. By late afternoon, the illusion of distance begins to fade. News arrives not as rumors now, but as confirmations. Cities once considered secure have fallen into other hands. Not burned, not destroyed, simply taken. Roman officials disappear. New rulers step in. Life continues, but Rome's authority does not. This is what frightens the empire most. There is no single enemy to rally against, no final battle to prepare for. The collapse is administrative, before it is military. Power changes hands quietly, without the thunder of legions. The empire does not fall to conquest, it dissolves. Along the frontiers, treaties mean less with each passing season. Rome promises land, gold, titles, but struggles to deliver any of them. When payment fails, resentment grows. When resentment grows, loyalty breaks. The empire has trained its rivals to think like Romans. Now those rivals realize Rome is no longer necessary. Inside the army, discipline erodes further. Units are loyal to commanders, commanders to survival. Generals make deals with barbarian leaders without consulting imperial authority. Some even plan for a future where Rome exists only as a name, useful for legitimacy, but irrelevant for power. The emperor, wherever he resides, rules through letters and messengers that arrive too late to matter. As the sun lowers, Rome itself feels increasingly vulnerable. The city walls, once symbols of invincibility, now inspire unease. They have been repaired, reinforced, but walls are only as strong as the men who defend them. And those men are fewer than they once were. Many legions are stationed far away, fighting wars that never truly end. Others have been disbanded, settled, or absorbed into local power structures. Rome's military presence near its own heart is thinner than anyone wants to admit. The unthinkable has already happened once. In living memory, Rome was sacked. When Alaric and the Visigoths entered the city, the shock echoed across the known world. Rome had been invaded before, but never like this. Not as a conquered prize, not as a helpless victim. The psychological wound never healed. Rome learned then that walls could be breached. That memory lingers now, unspoken but ever present. People glance at the gates differently. Night feels heavier. The city listens more closely to distant sounds. Fear has entered Rome, not as panic, but as anticipation. Within the ruling elite, survival becomes personal. Families secure private guards. Wealth is converted into land, then into alliances. Some senators quietly leave the city altogether, relocating to estates that feel safer than ancient marble halls. The empire's leaders are no longer planning for Rome's future. They are planning for their own. Religion, once a stabilizing force, now deepens the fractures. Christian leaders gain influence as imperial authority weakens. Bishops negotiate with invaders, organize food distribution, maintain order where civil institutions fail. For many citizens, the church becomes more reliable than the state. Rome is no longer the only power in Rome. As evening approaches, the balance shifts further. Outside the city, forces once described as barbarian are no longer nomadic threats. They are organized, settled, and confident. They understand Roman law, Roman warfare, Roman weakness. They know the empire is tired. The idea of Rome as an eternal center has already died beyond its borders. Now that realization begins to creep inward. Inside the city, lamps are lit, streets grow quieter. The sounds of daytime commerce fade into the low murmur of conversation behind closed doors. People speak in cautious tones. No one knows what tomorrow will bring, but fewer believe it will be better. Rome once believed history flowed toward it. Now history is flowing past it. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the final test of Rome's survival is no longer a question of if, only when. The night approaches. Night changes the city. As darkness settles over Rome, the noise fades, but tension does not. It thickens. Fires flicker in courtyards and alleyways, casting long shadows across walls that have seen triumphs, conspiracies, and executions. Rome has always been dangerous after sunset, but now the danger feels different, less criminal, more existential. This is the hour when fear has time to think. Guards patrol the gates, though many are poorly paid and poorly equipped. Some have not been paid at all. They stand watch, not out of pride, but because there is nothing else to do. Discipline survives as routine, not conviction. Beyond the walls, the countryside is dark and quiet, too quiet. Once, Roman roads were alive even at night, lit by torches, guarded by patrols. Now they belong to whoever dares to walk them. Bandits, deserters, displaced families, and armed groups move freely through land Rome no longer controls. The empire's borders are no longer lines, they are memories. Inside the city, the political center has hollowed out. The Senate House stands silent. Decisions that once echoed through the empire are now irrelevant. Real power has shifted to whoever can protect, feed, or negotiate. In many districts, that means local strongmen or church leaders. Authority has fragmented, and with it, the sense of a single Roman identity. People no longer ask, "What does Rome command?" They ask, "Who can keep us alive?" In private homes, elites argue late into the night. Some still believe recovery is possible, that the empire has survived crises before, that reform, discipline, or a strong ruler could reverse the decline. Others know better. They have watched the slow failures accumulate year after year. They understand that systems collapse not when they are attacked, but when they are no longer believed in. Faith in Rome is dying. Messages arrive under cover of darkness. Warnings, reports, desperate pleas. Entire regions are gone, not conquered, but abandoned. Governors have switched loyalties. Armies have chosen new masters. The imperial court responds with silence or promises it cannot keep. At this hour, Rome realizes something terrifying. It no longer controls events. It reacts to them. The army, once the backbone of imperial power, is now divided between obligation and opportunity. Soldiers ask why they should die for an empire that cannot pay them, cannot protect their families, and cannot guarantee the future. Loyalty becomes conditional. Commanders calculate survival instead of victory. The idea of Rome as something worth dying for is fading. Religion fills the vacuum left by power. Churches remain open through the night. People gather to pray, not for victory, but for mercy. Christian leaders speak of endurance, of a kingdom not of this world. To many, this offers comfort. To others, it feels like surrender. Rome's spiritual centre has shifted from glory to endurance. As midnight passes, the city feels smaller. Streets that once hosted triumphal processions now echo with footsteps that hurry rather than celebrate. The grandeur remains, but it has become a shell, impressive, empty, vulnerable. The empire is still alive, but it is no longer defending itself as an empire. Outside Rome, forces once kept apart by Roman power now move with purpose. They sense the weakness. They understand that Rome's greatest weapon, fear, has dulled. The empire that once crushed rebellion without hesitation now negotiates, delays, and retreats. Predators recognize this moment instinctively. This night is not the end, but it is the point of no return. Because when dawn comes, Rome will face a reality it can no longer deny, that the world has learned how to exist without it. And once that lesson is learned, it cannot be unlearned. Dawn returns to Rome, but it brings no renewal. The light reveals the same streets, the same buildings, the same monuments. Yet something fundamental has shifted. The city feels older this morning, heavier, as if centuries have pressed down overnight. Rome still stands, but it no longer feels central. It feels leftover. This is the hour of realization. The empire has not collapsed in a single night. No final trumpet has sounded. No decisive battle has been lost outside the gates. Instead, Rome awakens to the truth that the world it once commanded no longer waits for it. Messages arrive with the morning light, not urgent, not dramatic, just confirmations. Another province has stopped sending taxes. Another garrison has sworn loyalty to a local ruler. Another agreement has failed quietly. The machinery of empire does not shatter. It simply stops responding. Rome issues orders. No one obeys. At this hour, the emperor is still alive somewhere. The titles still exist. The laws are still written. But authority has lost its reach. Power now belongs to those who can enforce it immediately. Warlords, kings, bishops, generals who answer only to themselves. The empire has fragmented into realities Rome can no longer control. In the streets, people sense it even if they cannot articulate it. They notice soldiers behaving like mercenaries. Officials acting cautiously. Wealth disappearing into private hands. Public works neglected. The aqueducts still function, but maintenance is irregular. The systems that once made Rome exceptional now depend on improvisation. Great civilizations do not collapse when their monuments fall. They collapse when their systems stop being repaired. The Roman identity, once universal, now feels fragile. People begin to identify not as Romans, but as members of cities, regions, churches, or tribes. Loyalty shrinks inward. The idea of a shared destiny fades. Rome no longer defines who belongs. In the broader world, the consequences unfold rapidly. New kingdoms form atop Roman ruins. Roman law survives without Roman authority. Latin survives without Roman unity. The empire's legacy spreads even as the empire itself disappears. This is Rome's final paradox. It fails, but it does not vanish. By midday, the city resumes its routines. Markets reopen. Courts function imperfectly. Life continues, not because Rome is strong, but because people adapt. Survival replaces ambition. Endurance replaces conquest. The age of empire is ending. Rome's fall is not a moment to be witnessed. It is a condition to be lived through. A long descent where no single day feels catastrophic, until history looks back and marks the point where the world changed forever. Rome once shaped history. Now history moves on without it. What remains is memory, influence, and stone. and the knowledge that even the greatest power the world had ever known was not immune to time. By the afternoon, Rome is no longer alone in deciding its fate. What once would have been unthinkable is now routine. Negotiations with forces that were once enemies. Envoys arrive not to surrender, but to bargain. Land is exchanged for peace. Titles are granted to men who do not recognize Roman supremacy. Rome does not conquer anymore. It compromises. This is how control is surrendered without admitting defeat. Across the Western Empire, new powers rise inside old structures. Barbarian kings rule from Roman villas. They wear Roman clothing, use Roman administrators, collect Roman taxes, but they answer to no emperor. Rome's enemies do not destroy the empire. They inherit it. The Western Empire still exists on paper. In reality, it has already been replaced. The army adapts to this new order faster than the state. Soldiers swear loyalty to whoever pays them consistently. Roman command structures fracture into regional forces. Military service becomes less about defending the empire and more about securing local power. What remains of Rome's legions are legions in name only. Rome once exported order. Now it imports stability from those willing to provide it. In the city itself, the population shrinks. Wealthy families leave quietly, taking influence with them. Those who remain learn to live with uncertainty. Public games are rarer. Construction slows to a halt. Maintenance replaces expansion. Survival replaces vision. Rome has entered its twilight. The church continues to grow where the state recedes. Bishops become negotiators, judges and protectors. They organize food, mediate conflicts, and speak with authority that the Senate no longer possesses. For many citizens, loyalty shifts not out of ideology, but practicality. The future belongs to whoever functions. As the hours pass, Rome becomes something new, not a capital, but a relic. A city of immense prestige and diminishing power. Invaders no longer see it as a prize worth destroying. They see it as a symbol worth preserving. The irony is complete. Rome is spared because it is no longer feared. The Western Empire will formally fall, but the people living through this hour do not feel the drama historians will later assign to it. There is no announcement, no ceremony, just an absence of orders, of enforcement, of certainty. Power has moved elsewhere. When night approaches again, Rome prepares not for conquest, but for coexistence. The idea of restoring the empire fades from serious discussion. The goal now is continuity, to keep roads passable, food moving, violence contained. This is not the end of the world, but it is the end of Rome's world. What follows will not be Roman, even if it borrows Roman names. The empire has become history. The world does not end when Rome falls. That is the first truth history reveals. When the Western Roman Empire disappears, there is no silence, no emptiness, no sudden darkness. People wake, work, pray, and survive. Fields are still planted, children are still born. Life continues, just without Rome at its center. The change is subtle, but irreversible. Without imperial authority, the West fractures into local realities. Power becomes personal again. Protection is offered by those who can enforce it immediately: kings, warriors, churches. Loyalty narrows. Identity becomes regional. The idea of a single political order governing an entire continent fades into memory. The Roman world does not vanish. It transforms. Roman roads are still used, but no longer maintained as a unified system. Roman law survives in fragments, adapted by new rulers. Latin evolves, fractures, and becomes new languages. The empire's institutions collapse, but its influence spreads in unexpected ways. Rome loses control, yet shapes the future. In the East, the empire endures. Constantinople remains strong, wealthy, organized. It still calls itself Roman, still preserves imperial traditions, still believes in continuity. From its perspective, Rome has not fallen, it has merely retreated. But the West tells a different story. Here, memory replaces authority. Rome becomes an idea, invoked by kings seeking legitimacy, by churches claiming continuity, by historians trying to explain how something so powerful could fail. Its ruins stand as warnings and inspirations at once. The city itself shrinks. Marble is repurposed. Temples become churches. Forums fall silent. Rome lives on, not as a ruler of the world, but as a witness to time. Empires do not die because they are defeated. They die because the world learns how to live without them. Rome once shaped every horizon its citizens could imagine. Now it exists within history, studied rather than obeyed. Its fall becomes a lesson debated for centuries about power, corruption, overextension, and belief. But to those who lived through it, this was not a lesson. It was just life adapting. The fall of Rome was not a single hour, a single day, or a single event. It was a slow realization that the center no longer held, that authority had thinned, loyalty had shifted, and the future belonged to something else. And yet, even in collapse, Rome achieved something rare. It became immortal. Because long after its legions disappeared, long after its emperors were forgotten, the world continued to speak its language, use its laws, walk its roads, and measure itself against its memory. Rome fell, but it never truly left. The city did not know it was already dying. At dawn, Rome still breathed like it always had. Smoke rose from countless hearths. Merchants unlocked their stalls along narrow streets, polished smooth by centuries of feet. Water flowed through aqueducts that had once seemed like miracles made of stone. Bells rang, voices echoed. The capital of the world awoke convinced of its own permanence. For nearly 1,000 years, Rome had been more than a city. It was an idea pressed into marble and law, enforced by legions and carried by roads that stitched continents together. To live under Rome was to believe that order itself had a center, and that the center was here. But beneath the routine sounds of morning, something had changed. Along the northern frontiers, beyond forests the Romans barely understood, entire peoples were already moving. Not raiding parties, not mercenaries seeking pay, but nations in motion, families, wagons, weapons, gods, and grudges, all pushing south and west, driven by forces Rome could no longer see, let alone control. Inside the empire, the old confidence was thinning. The marble facades still gleamed, but behind them power had fractured. Emperors rose and fell with alarming speed. Generals swore loyalty, then withdrew it. Gold lost its weight. Promises lost their meaning. Rome had survived chaos before. Civil wars, assassinations, mad emperors, fires, plagues. Each time it had bent but not broken. That memory bred dangerous complacency. This too shall pass, they told themselves. Rome always endures. Yet this crisis was different, slower, deeper, and more corrosive. It was not one enemy at the gates, but pressure everywhere at once. Not a single collapse, but a long unravelling. In the late 4th century, the empire was already divided, though few wanted to admit it. East and West shared a name, but not a fate. The eastern provinces, richer, more urbanized, more stable, looked increasingly toward Constantinople. The West, poorer and more exposed, depended on aging infrastructure and overstretched armies. The legions were still feared, but they were no longer purely Roman. Recruits came from the very tribes Rome once fought, men who spoke Latin with accents, who prayed to different gods, who served for pay rather than identity. They marched under Roman standards, but their loyalty was fragile, conditional. Along the Danube frontier, Roman officers watched the river with growing unease. Reports filtered in of a terrifying force pushing westward from the distant steppe, the Huns. Fast, brutal, and seemingly unstoppable, they smashed into Gothic lands like a living storm. Villages burned, crops vanished, entire communities fled. And fleeing people do not disappear. They seek borders, they seek refuge. In the year 376, tens of thousands of Goths stood on the banks of the Danube, staring into Roman territory. Men with weapons, women clutching children, elders who remembered older wars with Rome. They were starving, desperate, terrified of what chased them from behind. They did not come as conquerors, not yet. They came asking for permission. Roman officials debated, let them in and risk instability, turn them away and force them into the arms of Rome's enemies. The empire had absorbed barbarians before. This could be managed, controlled, regulated. So the gates opened. It was a decision made with confidence, even arrogance. Rome believed it was still strong enough to shape events, to dictate terms, to turn refugees into soldiers and subjects. What it did not understand was how thin its margin for error had become. Corruption followed immediately. Roman commanders withheld food. Officials extorted families. Starving Goths were forced to sell their children into slavery in exchange for dog meat. Anger hardened into hatred. Gratitude turned into fury. The empire had invited a wounded people inside its borders and then betrayed them. When violence finally erupted, it spread like a disease. Roman farms burned, garrisons fell. Control slipped away, not because Rome lacked soldiers, but because it no longer inspired obedience. In 378, near the city of Adrianople, Emperor Valens marched out to restore order and reclaim authority. He underestimated his enemy. He ignored warnings. He rushed into battle seeking personal glory. The heat was suffocating. The Roman formations advanced, and then the Gothic cavalry returned to the field. What followed was annihilation. The Roman army collapsed under waves of attack. Veterans died beside raw recruits. Officers fell. Standards vanished into dust and blood. By nightfall, the emperor himself was gone, killed, burned, or lost forever. His body never recovered. It was more than a military defeat. It was a psychological rupture. For the first time in centuries, a Roman emperor had died at the hands of barbarian forces on Roman soil. The illusion of invincibility shattered in a single afternoon. Word traveled fast. Along roads that once carried confidence, now moved fear. If an emperor could fall, what else could? Rome did not collapse that day, but something essential broke: trust in destiny, faith in control, belief that the future was already written in Rome's favor. From this moment on, the empire would react instead of command, patch instead of rebuild, compromise instead of dominate. And the forces gathering beyond its borders were only growing stronger. The city still woke each morning. The aqueducts still flowed. The Senate still met beneath ancient roofs. But Rome had taken its first irreversible step toward the end. After Adrianople, the empire learned to speak a new language, the language of survival. Rome did not respond with vengeance. It could not. The legions needed years to rebuild, and the enemies inside its borders were too many, too entrenched. Instead, the empire adapted in a way that would have been unthinkable in earlier centuries. It negotiated. Gothic leaders were offered land within imperial territory. They were allowed to settle as semi-autonomous communities, bound by treaties rather than chains. In return, they would provide soldiers when Rome called. On parchment, it looked like diplomacy. In reality, it was a quiet surrender of authority. For the first time, Rome no longer insisted on full assimilation. The empire was no longer absorbing barbarians. It was accommodating them. This shift changed everything. Across the western provinces, similar arrangements followed. Franks settled along the Rhine. Vandals pressed through Gaul. Burgundians carved out enclaves. Each group entered Roman territory not as invaders, but as allies, allies who answered to their own kings, obeyed their own laws, and worshipped their own gods. The imperial map still looked intact. The reality on the ground was fragmentation. In Rome itself, few fully understood the danger. The Senate clung to ceremony. Aristocratic families invested in villas rather than defences. The poor relied on grain distributions that arrived more irregularly each year. The city had not been sacked in nearly 800 years, an eternity long enough to feel like forever. Power, meanwhile, drifted away from emperors and toward generals. One of them was a man named Stilicho, half Roman, half Vandal. Stilicho embodied the new empire, mixed, pragmatic, dangerous. As commander-in-chief of the Western Roman armies, he became the true power behind the throne, ruling in the name of a young and inexperienced emperor, Honorius. Stilicho understood the reality Rome faced. The West did not have the manpower to fight endless wars on every frontier. His strategy was containment, delay, balance. He made treaties with barbarian leaders. He played enemies against one another. He bought time. For a while, it worked, but Stilicho's greatest failure was not military. It was political. In a world ruled by suspicion, his background made him vulnerable. Senators whispered that he was more loyal to barbarians than Romans. Courtiers feared his influence. Rivals waited patiently. And beyond the Alps, a new threat was forming. Alaric, king of the Visigoths, had once fought for Rome. He knew Roman tactics, Roman weaknesses, Roman arrogance. His people had been promised land, payment, respect, and received delay, humiliation, and betrayal. Alaric did not want to destroy Rome. He wanted recognition, a title, a place within the imperial system. But the empire hesitated, stalled, insulted him with half measures. So Alaric marched. In the winter of 401, Gothic forces crossed into Italy itself. Panic spread faster than armies. Italy had been the heartland of the empire, safe, sacred, untouchable. Now the unthinkable was happening. Stilicho scrambled to respond. He defeated Alaric in battle, not once but twice. The invasions were halted. Rome breathed again, but victory bred fear, not gratitude. In 408, a wave of paranoia swept the imperial court. Rumours of betrayal, accusations of conspiracy. Stilicho, the man who had held the West together, was arrested. He did not resist. Executed on imperial orders, his death was followed by something worse. Thousands of barbarian soldiers who had served Rome faithfully, along with their families, were massacred across Italy. Their crime was ancestry. Their punishment was slaughter. Survivors fled to the only leader who would take them, Alaric. What had been negotiation turned into vengeance. By 409, Alaric stood at the gates of Rome. Inside the city, terror ruled. The grain supply was cut. Starvation stalked the streets. Mothers sold heirlooms for bread. Slaves whispered of escape. Senators argued while people died. Rome tried to bargain. Gold was paid. Hostages exchanged. Promises made. But trust was gone. On the night of August 24th, 410, the Salarian Gate opened. Whether by treachery or desperation, no one would ever agree. The Visigoths poured in. For 3 days, Rome burned. Temples were looted. Palaces stripped bare. The cries of the wounded echoed through streets that had once hosted triumphal parades. Though churches were spared, nothing else was sacred. The city that had ruled the world was helpless. When it was over, Alaric did not linger. He had made his point. But the damage was irreversible. Across the empire, the shock was profound. Rome, eternal Rome, had fallen. Not to some distant enemy, but to men who had once served its banners. Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, captured the moment simply. The city, which had taken the whole world, was itself taken. The psychological centre of the Western Empire was gone, and yet the empire still lived. Barely. Rome survived the sack of 410, but it never recovered from the knowledge that it could be violated. The city's walls were repaired. Senators returned to their villas. Rituals resumed. Yet something invisible had fled along with the smoke. Confidence, authority, the quiet certainty that Rome stood above history rather than inside it. In the years that followed, the Western Empire entered a state of permanent emergency. Emperors no longer ruled from Rome. The court drifted north to Ravenna, a city protected by swamps and water rather than pride. It was defensible, isolated, and symbolic of what the empire had become: cautious, withdrawn, afraid. Beyond Italy, the provinces were unravelling. In Gaul, Roman governors clung to shrinking territories, surrounded by Frankish and Burgundian kingdoms that were Roman only in name. In Spain, Visigoths settled as de facto rulers. In Britain, imperial authority simply evaporated. One final letter told the cities to look to their own defences. Then Rome fell silent. Britain slipped into legend. The empire did not fall with a single blow. It leaked away. The army, once the backbone of Roman power, became a patchwork. Units were underpaid, undersupplied, and increasingly loyal to their commanders rather than the state. Generals rose not through merit alone, but through brute force and the support of their troops. One of these men was Constantius, a ruthless but capable soldier who restored some order through relentless campaigning. He married into the imperial family, became emperor, and briefly stabilized the West. When he died, the stability died with him. What followed was a parade of weak rulers and child emperors, men raised to power only to be discarded by the next strong man. Real authority rested with whoever controlled the army, and armies were expensive. To pay them, the state squeezed what remained of its taxpayers. Landowners fled their obligations. Peasants tied themselves to estates in exchange for protection, sacrificing freedom for survival. Cities shrank. Trade routes decayed. Coinage grew scarce. An economy built on movement and exchange slowly froze in place. And then came the Vandals. In 429, a Vandal army crossed into North Africa, Rome's most vital province. Africa was not peripheral, it was the breadbasket of the West. Grain shipments from Carthage fed Rome, Ravenna, and the army itself. The Roman response was slow, divided, and disastrously incompetent. Within a decade, the Vandals had taken Carthage and built a fleet. Suddenly, Rome no longer controlled the sea that once bore its name. Piracy followed. Coastal cities burned. The grain supply became hostage to foreign kings. Hunger returned to Italy. The psychological wound deepened when the Vandals, now masters of the Western Mediterranean, turned their gaze toward Rome itself. In 455, after political chaos and imperial murder, the city was again left exposed. This time, there would be no negotiation. The Vandal fleet entered the Tiber unopposed. For 2 weeks, Rome was stripped systematically. Statues, gold, silver, sacred objects, centuries of accumulated wealth vanished into ships bound for Africa. Even the empress and her daughters were taken captive. The sack was less violent than Alaric's, but more devastating. It was not rage that guided the Vandals, but efficiency. Rome was no longer an enemy to fear. It was a storehouse to empty. Across the empire, hope collapsed. The Western Roman emperor still existed in name, but his authority barely extended beyond Italy. In Gaul and Spain, barbarian kings ruled openly. Laws were issued, but few obeyed them. Taxes were assessed, but rarely collected. The empire had become a ghost that still spoke. In this vacuum, new loyalties formed. People looked to local strongmen, bishops, warlords, anyone who could offer protection. The idea of Rome as a living power faded with each generation. Yet the end did not come swiftly. Instead, it dragged on, a long twilight of survival without strength. And in that twilight, the final emperor would rise, a boy with a legendary name. he was called Romulus. It was a name heavy with prophecy, history, and irony. The name of Rome's mythical founder, given now to a child born into an empire that could barely defend its own heartland. Romulus Augustulus was not meant to rule. He was elevated in 475 by his father, Orestes, a former Roman officer who had once served Attila the Hun himself. Orestes understood power in the late empire. Emperors were symbols, armies were reality. The boy emperor sat on the throne while others decided his fate. By this time, the Western Roman state was little more than Italy and fragments of authority. The treasury was empty. The army was dominated by Germanic mercenaries, men who had fought Rome's wars for decades without ever being truly accepted as Roman. They wanted land. When their demand was refused, they found a leader. His name was Odoacer. Odoacer was not a king in the Roman sense. He was a commander, a negotiator, a soldier hardened by years of service under Roman banners. He did not seek to destroy Rome. He sought to rule what Rome could no longer control. In 476, Odoacer marched on Ravenna. There was no epic siege, no heroic last stand. The Western Roman Empire ended not with thunder, but with quiet inevitability. Orestes was captured and executed. Romulus Augustulus was spared. Too young, too irrelevant, too tragic to kill. He was sent into exile with a pension, a child dismissed along with an empire. No one crowned a new Western emperor. Instead, Odoacer sent the imperial regalia, the symbols of Roman authority, east to Constantinople. He declared that the West no longer needed its own emperor. One ruler was enough. The Eastern Roman emperor agreed. With that gesture, the Western Roman Empire ceased to exist. There was no announcement, no mourning, no single moment when the world seemed to change. Life continued much as it had the day before. Crops were planted, laws were enforced, bishops preached, soldiers marched. But the chain of authority that had once linked Britain to Africa, Spain to Syria, had snapped. Rome had fallen, not in flames this time, but in silence. In Italy, Odoacer ruled as king, maintaining Roman administration while commanding Germanic warriors. The Senate still met. Latin was still spoken. The idea of Rome lingered, even as its reality faded. To the east, however, the story was very different. Constantinople did not see itself as the survivor of a fallen empire. It saw itself as the empire, Rome intact, Rome eternal. Emperors there continued to issue laws, command armies, and dream of restoration. One of them would try. In the 6th century, Emperor Justinian launched an ambitious campaign to reclaim the West. His generals reconquered North Africa, Italy, and parts of Spain. For a moment, it seemed as if Rome might rise again. But the world had changed. The wars devastated the very lands they reclaimed. Cities emptied. Fields lay fallow. Plague followed conquest. When the Lombards invaded Italy soon after, the empire could not stop them. The Western Empire was gone, and it was not coming back. What replaced it was not darkness, but transformation. Roman law lived on. The Church inherited imperial structure. Latin evolved into new tongues. Roads decayed, but paths remained. Kings ruled where emperors once had. Rome did not vanish. It became memory, and memory, in time, becomes myth. But the fall of Rome was not just an ending, it was a beginning of a new Europe, forged from the ruins of an old world. Long after the last Western emperor vanished into exile and footnotes, people continued to live their lives among Rome's remains, scarcely aware that they were standing at the edge of a vanished world. Children played in broken amphitheatres. Farmers guided oxen along roads laid down by surveyors whose names had been forgotten for centuries. Stone by stone, Rome was dismantled, not by enemies, but by survival. Columns became farm walls, statues became lime, Temples became churches. The empire was no longer ruled, but reused. For those who lived through its final generations, the fall of Rome did not arrive as a single cataclysm. There was no universal day of mourning, no sense that history itself had ended. Instead, there was a long, quiet descent, an age of constant adjustment. Each year, something worked a little less well. Each generation remembered less of how things used to be. The great promise of Rome had been distance conquered by order. A farmer in Gaul, a merchant in Syria, a soldier in Britain, all had once belonged to the same system, the same laws, the same calendar, the same authority. When that system dissolved, the world shrank. Trade routes withered, cities that depended on imperial logistics emptied. Coinage vanished from daily life. People stopped thinking in terms of empire and began thinking in terms of valleys, rivers, and walls. Safety replaced citizenship as the central concern of life. Yet this was not merely collapse, it was transformation. In the vacuum left by imperial authority, new powers rose, not with marble and legions, but with belief and loyalty. The Christian Church became the most Roman institution still standing. Its bishops governed cities. Its hierarchy mirrored imperial administration. Its memory preserved Rome's language, its texts, and its sense of universal order. Monasteries became islands of continuity in a fragmented world. In cold scriptoria, monks copied Roman law, philosophy, history, not because they foresaw a renaissance, but because preservation itself felt sacred. Without them, much of Rome would have vanished entirely. Even those once called barbarians carried Rome forward. Visigothic, Frankish, and Ostrogothic kings ruled Roman populations using Roman law. They issued decrees in Latin. They styled themselves as protectors of Roman tradition. To rule Rome's former lands, they had to become Roman in spirit, if not in name. This was Rome's final victory, cultural rather than military. The empire that could no longer command obedience still commanded imitation. And far to the east, beyond the ruins of the West, the Roman Empire endured for another 1,000 years. From Constantinople, emperors still called themselves Romans. They defended Roman law, Roman ceremony, Roman ambition. To them, the fall of the West was a tragedy, but not the end. History, however, had moved on. The ancient world, with its slave economies, city-states, and imperial certainties, gave way to something new. Medieval Europe emerged not from the destruction of Rome, but from its transformation. Rome was not buried, it was absorbed. The story of Rome's fall is not a warning about weakness alone. It is a lesson about complexity. Rome did not collapse because it lacked power, but because its power no longer fit the world it ruled. The tools that built the empire were not enough to sustain it. Civilizations are living systems. They survive by adapting honestly to change, and they fail when adaptation becomes denial. Rome believed it was eternal. In that belief lay both its greatness and its undoing. And yet even now, Rome speaks, in law codes, in languages, in cities, in the idea that a civilization combines strangers into something larger than themselves. Empires fall, but ideas endure, and Rome, more than any empire before or since, became an idea strong enough to outlive its own death.